Okay, Don Stacy's YouTube channel. I'm continuing the reading of the Impressionist novel I just completed. And some of the sections are titled. This one is called Octavia Steps into Jack's Life. The guest bungalow in which Jack was staying gave him a sense of privacy that for the last 5 years he had gone without for the most part since his divorce from Erica. He had almost forgotten what it was like. Apart from the Thursdays when a small team of groundskeepers descended upon the property with self-propelled lawnmowers and gasoline-powered leaf blowers, his surroundings were idyllic. Of course, the man who owned this property, Stephen Hunterberg, the aging son of a wealthy aluminum producer and one of the producers for the series Jack was helping to write, had the money to burn. Had money to burn. The man's wife, Octavia, spoke with a European accent. Jack thought perhaps she was originally from Germany. And he was not far off the mark. Indeed, she was from Austria, Arnold Schwarzenegger's home country. Although throughout the first few years of her marriage to Hunterberg, she had been content, if not happy, during the last several months, Octavia had grown weary of Stephen and his continual philandering. Presently, she had convinced herself that he had acquired a new mistress, and she based this conclusion on his recent behavior, such as those phone calls he'd been receiving lately, where he would excuse himself, saying that the call involved a business matter, and step out of the room. Oh, he's been quite discreet about it, she thought. Typo. Quite. Oh, he's been quite discreet about it, she thought. She hadn't any idea of who he might be seeing. But for Octavia, this no longer mattered. Embittered resentment had come to fill and dominate her days. So when Jack happened to appear on the scene, she felt great relief whenever she spoke with him. Usually whenever he came to the main house to eat one of Rosaria's dinners, she thought he was quite charming. Not the usual sort of clammed up and often self-consumed sort of screenwriter Stephen brought around on occasion. And the novelists who showed up now and again were even worse. The more bold among them sometimes made a play for her, which she rebuffed with a witheringly worded refusal, culminating with the warning she found herself compelled to issue at random intervals: just fuck off. She'd been living in Bonn and working as a model when she first met Hunterberg. The aura of success radiated from him like a beacon, and she felt immediately drawn to him. After merely 3 weeks of getting to know each other, Stephen asked her to marry him. "Stop joking around," she told him. "We hardly know each other." But he was very good at persuasion and eventually talked her into accepting his proposal. And for those first few years, she had never enjoyed life more. Stephen would spend money as though he had an inexhaustible supply of it. They led a pleasurable and opulent life, but those very pleasant days were now all in the past. On a Saturday afternoon, while Hunterberg was out playing golf and schmoozing with potential investors, Octavia strolled over to the guest house to say hello to Jack and visit with him for a while. She felt bored, longing for pleasant, refreshing company. Although she could have phoned one of her girlfriends that afternoon, she did not feel so inclined. And she kept thinking about Stephen's reclusive guest in their backyard bungalow. A light, brief knocking at the door broke Jack's concentration, and he rose and stepped out from behind the desk where he'd been working to greet his visitor, whom he automatically assumed was Stephen Hunterberg. But of course, when he pulled open the door, there stood the man's wife instead. "Hello, Jack," she said. "Well, aren't you going to invite me in?" While looking into her eyes and feeling instantly captivated, the broad smile, he said, "Yeah, sure. Come on in, Octavia." After her phone call with Jack that evening at the dinner table, Erica mentioned to Theo what he had told her, while Susie and Leland looked on astonished that their dad was now working in Hollywood. Theo set his fork down and said, "So, Jack finally managed to pull it off, after all this time. Apparently he's playing with the big boys now." Erica glanced at the children and then returned her gaze to Theo and said, "He told me this was a huge break for him." "Yeah," Theo said, "I guess it would be." Erica did nothing to discourage her children. When both Leland and Susie began to enthuse, now feeling deeply impressed by their father's small leap up the ladder of success in show business, she presented them with the slightest of smiles, as though preparatory to a wince. And very soon Theo jumped in and began to encourage them. Almost without knowing it, he had relinquished his disapproval of Jack's comedic undertaking, having jettisoned his job as an announcer and spin wizard at an AM radio station out there at Medical Lake. "No doubt the son of a bitch is making a hell of a lot more money now," Theo reflected. And then he began to wonder how Erica might feel down the road if Jack actually did make it big and had managed to sustain that level of success over a respectable period of time, say 4 years. What would she say about Jack then? "He's either going to swim or sink," she said. The kids had become excited while boasting about their dad, and had even begun to wrestle some while still seated next to each other. "Susie, Leland, go." "Susie, Leland, go up to your room and start doing your homework. Now." They scrambled out of their chairs and soon disappeared up the stairway. Theo was looking at Erica as she listened for a moment while the kids treaded up the stairs. Soon she turned and held Theo's gaze and said, "Maybe now he's begun to think that sacrificing a steady job, not to mention his family, really was worth it." "Fuck, who knows?" Theo said. On the day of Justine's third visit following his birth, Patrick was showing spunk and initiative in his efforts to stand up while grasping onto the rim of his playpen. Bernie happened to notice him doing this on the lad's third attempt. The 2 previous tries had seen him drop back down onto his rump with a look of uncomfortable surprise, as though he were asking himself what went wrong, what exactly happened just then. Why couldn't he do what he saw himself doing a moment ago? Bernie squatted down in front of the playpen so that he could look directly into the boy's face. Lips moistened with drool, while he began to push and pull back and forth with a gleeful, wide grin. "Well now, little buddy, you've made quite an accomplishment. I'll bet you're already thinking of how you can get out of there." He patted the boy's head and flicked a finger across the underside of his chin. then rose and went to the hallway to Sheila's office, where she'd been since late morning writing computer code for a website one of her clients had commissioned her to produce and perfect until the site functioned flawlessly, which she had guaranteed would be the case. All her attention was focused on this task, and he merely stood in the doorway and watched her for a few moments until she happened to glance away from the computer screen. "Bernie, how long have you been standing there?" "Oh, I don't know, half a minute maybe. But I wanted to tell you that just now, our little boy has taught himself to stand up by holding on to the top of the playpen. Then he began to shake the thing for all it was worth." Smiling, she said, "Oh, I've got to see this." She rose and followed Bernie into the living room, where she found Patrick fully engaged in his newly discovered pastime. "Look at you," she crooned, then lifted the boy out of the playpen and held him away from her just enough so that she could look into his eyes and say, "Auntie Justine is coming to see you, Patrick. Did you know that?" "Oh, yes, she is. Yes, she is." She jounced him up and down as she said this, and soon elicited a shriek of delight from the little fellow. She then lowered him down onto the floor, where he began to crawl about, exploring the living room. Soon after this, Justine arrived. Justine lifted Sheila's baby onto her lap, and he crawled up to her. She bounced her knee some, and Patrick let out his gurgling approval. Justine toyed with the various sounds he was making, his head steady, while she engaged him with her cheerful assurances that his would be a good and happy life full of promise thanks to her talented and devoted parents. On his own, as he crawled about with changing purpose drawn toward any object which aroused his curiosity, Patrick moved his head slowly from side to side like a prowling cat. Justine mentioned this impression, and Sheila laughed. A few hours later, following dinner and a drowsy baby's placement in his bedroom crib, the three of them sat in the living room and talked. Sheila spoke of the website she was working on. Then Bernie talked some about the film production company he was hopeful would soon choose Seattle and its environs as their filming location. With some companies, he said, it takes more time to shepherd a deal across the finish line. Sometimes I have to coax them with the promise of reduced licensing and permit fees. But then I say that sort of thing to nearly everyone, and especially to the newcomer directors who have to scrape up every last penny they can to finance their production, mostly their ability to keep paying the film crew members their twice-monthly wages. The risks a film company takes from the very outset, Justine said, seems like a very precarious way to earn a living, Bernie. Well, it is, he said, without a doubt. And not only that, but the very venues and manner in which many of these films are shown nowadays has changed quite abruptly, really, she said. And all these relatively recent changes were preceded by the slow erosion of the traditional sized theater, which could hold over 500 people. Many of those have been closed down over the years in favor of the multiplex theaters, offering simultaneously up to 12 different films, from, say, 1 in the afternoon on through to the last admission time at 9 o'clock. Then, perhaps concurrent with that, was the advent of HBO and Showtime on cable TV. And once they expanded from cable to the internet, all bets were off. During lunch in the cafeteria at the junior high school Susie attended, one of her friends, Linda Fitzsimmons, mentioned that her parents had watched Saturday night at the Improv, and who would have thought but Jack Bayfield was among the lineup. And when he walked up to the mic, the audience gave him a loud round of applause, and Linda said that her mother turned to her and went like, "See that guy on the stage right now? That's your friend Susie's father." Word of this extraordinary news traveled quickly throughout the school, and very soon it seemed to Susie that everyone except the nerds and the geeks knew about her dad. Then, not long after that, on a day she was waiting for Mrs. Jesperson to finish her lunch break and show up to unlock the door to English class, when Goody Two-Shoes Shirley McDoodle came up to her and said with a snotty sneer, "Your dad's an atheist, Susie. That's what my parents say." In return, Susie said, "So what if he is, Shirley? Not everyone is as religious as you are. You probably still say your prayers every night before you go to bed." "I do not." "And I'll bet you still want to be a virgin when you get married. Get real." As yet, they hadn't spoken to one another again since that brief, though heated exchange. After a few days, Susie mentioned this to Erica. "Well, sweetheart, your father was never very religious, but he was perfectly fine with you kids being brought up as Catholics." And he knew from the start that I wanted to do that. We talked about it a lot back then. And I knew when I agreed to marry your dad that he had zero interest in Christianity in general, and especially that he hadn't the slightest desire to convert to Catholicism, even though he once told me that if he ever did start going to church on a regular basis, it would be a toss-up whether he went to a Catholic church or a Greek Orthodox church. "But then what if I turn out like him, Mom?" "I don't know, Susie. You'll just have to cross that bridge when you come to it." "Oh, Mom, you always say stuff like that these days." "Sometimes these questions you've been asking me lately don't have any easy answers, dear. You begin to pose some very adult problems. Remember what we talked about just last week?" "Yes, how could I forget?" "Well, don't forget that you were the one who brought up the matter. And what we talked about is very important in terms of your own life. In a few more years, you're going to start going out with boys, and you're going to explore the boundaries. I get that. Believe me, I was the same way. But I knew that if I ever became pregnant, my life would change forever, because then I would become a mother. I would have never given the baby up for adoption, and I certainly never would have gotten an abortion. When I was the age you are now, such a thing would have been out of the question. The script writing team was now engaged in their formulations for the general thrust of the final episode. Peter Railovich was pumped, charged, electrified by the thought that he and the other three writers had brought his project, his baby, to near completion. Of course, his principal intent now was to come up with a sequence of scenes which would lead with flawless logic and a compulsion of necessity to a hilarious and uproarious conclusion loaded with plenty of situational irony and sheer farce. This final episode, as he had previously explained, rather needlessly, Jack thought, to the other three writers, could very easily serve as a springboard whose impetus would then convince the producers to finance and underwrite a second season. Well, that's what we're all aiming for. That's what we all want. The near steady work a second and possibly a third season would give us. Jack here could even afford to buy a house somewhere in L.A., get his ass out of Spokane, where he may as well be on the moon. By mid-afternoon on Monday, the four of them had devised enough dialogue to more than support and vouchsafe 10 minutes of finished camera-ready content. Railovich was beaming. Railovich was beaming with satisfaction and pleasure, and he then insisted that everyone break off for the day and then meet up at his favorite evening watering hole. Both Mort Sinich and Sarah James were married, and they begged off. That left Jack, who had no acceptable excuse at hand not to go. He got into Railovich's car, and the veteran screenwriter and creator of several successful past series drove to one of his favorite haunts where a few tourists ever set foot. Once they were inside the place and found a table and sat down, Railovich said, "Now, this joint is one of the more closely guarded secrets in Beverly Hills. I've talked to the owner a few times, Jake Rafferty, and he told me once what his business philosophy was with regard to this place. He said that he's always intended that Jake's place remain an exclusive venue for the Hollywood anointed, and that mere tourists or local curiosity seekers would be discouraged from visiting. He's instructed the staff to treat every obvious tourist like crap, every out-of-stater like shit. And of course, word spread about the different treatment doled out at Jake's place. You almost have to know someone to get a second drink, like those private nightclubs in Salt Lake City where some established member who happens to be sitting nearby is willing to sponsor you." The weekend had been rough, grueling. Patrick was not only suffering the emergence of his first few teeth, he had also been struck with a bout of the flu, which was circulating during that late October. About a week prior to this, Sheila and Bernie had taken Patrick, stuffed into his stroller, out for a walk. They stopped in at a cafe for dinner, and the waitress who served their food was having a problem preventing herself from coughing. 2 days later, Patrick began showing symptoms of what Sheila's mother referred to as Palouse lightning, her colorful designation for the stomach flu. So, neither Sheila nor Bernie had gotten much sleep, and neither one of them were in a pleasant mood that Monday morning which so quickly followed. They sat at the breakfast table in a gloom-ridden silence, but at one point Sheila finally said, "Bernie, there's a woman here at Pacific Rim that runs a daycare center out of her home. I'm going to take Patrick over to her place later this morning. I won't be able to get any work done otherwise." "Sure, I can see that easily enough. So what's this woman's daily rate she's asking for?" For a drop-in, we're looking at $30 a day. For someone who brings their kid every day, $300 a month. Fuck, that's almost as much as I pay for the monthly parking lot fee. Pretty soon it's coming to that. Patrick's first birthday isn't too far off now. I know. I won't be able to work and watch him at the same time. It would just be impossible. I'd never get anything done. Yeah, I know. During his flight back to Spokane, Jack had ample time to recall and reflect upon the last 2 or 3 months of his life. Outwardly, he had done remarkably well from the point of view of John and Joan Q. Public. Among the Hollywood elite, and particularly among the top-flight comics making people all around the country laugh, Jack was still hardly much more than a non-entity. But he thought at least he got his Screenwriters Guild card out of it. That door, a rather significant one, had finally swung open for him. But once within this rarefied world of screenwriters and playwrights, Jack knew that he stood at the bottom rung of the ladder. He would now have to work his ass off even harder than ever, because now he was among some of the best semi-secured harboring themselves on this bottom rung, this station within which they now occupied. Some of the less confident among them would share in their mutual problem of their inability to distinguish the qualitative difference between posing with conviction as a screenwriter and, in every pragmatic sense of the word, being a scriptwriter. At bottom, a matter of experience. As with the blues, the lyrics to those songs emerged out of the songwriter's hard luck or a hard-scrabbled past. For instance, Carly Simon, whose wealthy father was of Simon and Schuster fame, would not have been very convincing had she tried to sing the blues like Billie Holiday, or more recently Maria Muldaur. Though she still tapped into the universal human experience of pain and suffering, from what the Buddhists like to perceive as the yoke of existence, but Miss Simon developed a very personal style and sang her own lyrics with a distinctive, unique voice. Once back at his apartment, Jack filled a glass with his favorite Madeira and took up his tobacco pipe and filled it with cannabis and a pinch of Borkum Riff while steamy water was filling the tub. He soon slipped into the womb-like embrace of the soothing water, almost too hot for comfort, but not quite. Nearby on the closed toilet seat was the newspaper and a Murakami novel, as well as a notepad and ballpoint pen so that he could write down any ideas which might occur to him, and of those which could perhaps further strike him as having some useful possibilities. By the end of the nearly 11 weeks Jack had spent in L.A., nearly 3 months, he had come to be struck by the fact that, for the time being at least, he was no longer itinerant, and he was no longer compelled to return to the road, in itself an absolute relief. No longer did he have to endure near continuous travel. The road was relentless, never-ending. His newly found semi-rootedness felt very good to him. And his wages, he certainly had no complaints there. At the conclusion of having worked for Railovich, Jack now had just over 10 grand in his checking account. Presently, Jack had grabbed up his cell phone, scrolled down through his numerous contacts to T-Bone Jefferson, and touched the phone icon to initiate the call. Well, if it ain't my old Jackson Bayfield. If it ain't my own Jackson Bayfield, T-Bone answered after the 4th ring. So, what the hell are you up to these days, my man? Oh, not a hell of a lot, T-Bone. There's a big fat lull looming on the horizon. Man, what do you expect? You said you wanted some time off. You explained why, and I could dig it. Oh, and by the way, how did that time of yours go down there in L.A.? Was it what you expected? Well, that's the thing. I really didn't know what to expect. This brainstorming business with a few other writers was completely new to me. Prior to that, I'd always thought of writing as a solitary activity. For example, Cervantes wrote most of Don Quixote while he was in prison. So, the author of Don Quixote was a jailbird. I didn't know that. For any mature adult, 5 years, the very thought of 5 years, seems like quite a stretch of time. For the rapidly growing Patrick Youngers, 5 years now measured the entire span of his life, so far. 5 years. And as would be expected, a considerable amount of change had occurred in the lives of all the individuals involved in this lengthy tale. Out of all the people you have come to know here, attentively kind and persistent reader, Jack Bayfield had undergone the most thoroughgoing transformation. Owing to both years-long dedicated preparation and not to mention plain good luck, Jack's career in show business had finally begun to soar. By this time, his name had become a